the first question is, whenever we speak to our advisors, our social media and market advisors, they always tell us, look, you got to make these YouTube videos short and quick because people might lose interest. So I'm going to have to ask you the final question as the first question, because we have no guarantee that everyone will watch the entire video. So being that there's going to be a lot of people that see this, and this might be the only opportunity you get to speak to them in your lives. They might never read your book, never watch another video. They might never have anything to do with this subject again. In 3 minutes, I would like for you to each tell us what it is that you want to tell them. In other words, from all the books, the movies, everything, the research you've done, at this moment, if someone is sitting home on YouTube watching this, what do they need to know that will affect them? What do you have to say that's so important that they don't know that is going to affect their lives that they might not understand? If you would each answer that question.
Gosh, well, if it's alphabetical order, I'm sorry I married and hyphenated and start with an A now. But I think it's absolutely critical for people to realize that ultimately, the way in which we treat the earth, the way in which we treat the soil, is really about the respect that we have for ourselves, for our own bodies, and also for our communities. And one of the things that's been the most important revelation for me over the past couple of years while researching and then writing a precautionary tale was to really suddenly realize, as you do so often, I think in writing a book, is you realize that some of your basic assumptions were wrong. And one of the assumptions that I carried with me for a long time and probably also said as an educator was that it was really incumbent upon farmers to be the ones who were helping move us forward with the organic movement. And however you choose to define or understand that word organic, I think that the mistake in many ways is that, in fact, we can't leave that on the shoulders of the farmers, that really it is about communities, and it's the power of what one individual can do to spark a community and then to start a community movement, which in the case, I think, of malts in the small Italian town in the Italian Alps, I think in that case, suddenly we realized that what started there can become an international movement. So never underestimate yourselves. I think that's a big point.
Although we commonly hear that genetically engineered foods are safe and that science says so and that people who have concerns are tantamount to climate change deniers, when we actually look at the facts, it's very clear that the way the scientific establishment has behaved in regard to GMOs is very different than the way it's behaved in regard to climate change. In the latter, in climate change, there's been responsible activity. They've upheld science. In fact, if anything, too many scientists have been overly cautious in the way they present information and make conclusions. In the case of GMOs, important pillars of the scientific community have repeatedly misrepresented facts, pushed out misinformation under the banner of science, attacked science who are actually trying to uphold the standards of science, and unfortunately imposed high-risk foods on unsuspecting populations around the world. If the scientific establishment had actually behaved as scientists when it comes to GMOs, if they had honestly communicated the facts, if they'd upheld the standards of science, I wouldn't be here. I wouldn't have had to write the book. There would be no genetically engineered crops grown anywhere. That's not an exaggeration. That's why they misrepresent the facts so solidly. And another major agency that has helped in this bamboozlement is the United States Food and Drug Administration. If the FDA alone had merely told the truth and followed U.S. food safety law, then again, there wouldn't be GMOs on the market either, because the FDA has repeatedly covered up the warnings of its own scientists about the abnormal risks of genetically engineered foods. It has lied about the facts, and it is repeatedly and is still breaking U.S. food safety law in order to keep these foods on the market. So don't ever let anybody sell you this bill of goods that if you're afraid of GMOs and somehow you're against science. No, actually, you're on the side that's in favor of science and against the people who claim to be representing it, who are actually degrading it.
It is the same with pesticides. The use of pesticides in our food is based on a scam and not on science. The fact is that not one formulated pesticide that are used by farmers here in the US or any other country, and there are 1,400 approved pesticides, not one has scientific testing for the actual diseases that we suffer from. So in other words, not one has been tested for cancer or heart disease or for birth defects. The governments will say they are scientifically tested, but they don't actually test the product that farmers use. They only test one ingredient in that product. That one ingredient is usually less than 5%. So it is a scientific nonsense to say if you test less than 5% of a cocktail of poisons that it has the same level of toxicity as the whole cocktail. The independent science shows that in most cases, the actual products used on our food are hundreds of % more toxic than the accepted testing by the pesticide authorities. The other thing I want to say is this, is there is not one independent scientific peer-reviewed study showing the safety of one pesticide for our children. But the independent science shows that the smallest levels of pesticides are doing enormous damage to the health of our children. And what type of society permits our children to be damaged by pesticides? For me, this is the worst of child abuse, particularly when we have hundreds of scientific studies showing this abuse, and the pesticide authorities and the pesticide companies are working together to basically continue this abuse. An example of that is an organophosphate called chlorpyrifos that the US EPA was about to ban, but the pesticide companies lobbied the government and got this ban overturned. So these poisons now are damaging our children. Damaging children, we know that it damages their developing brains when they are as a fetus and while they are born. So what we're seeing here is neglect by the pesticide authorities in collusion with the pesticide companies. The fact is that there is no evidence that any pesticide product that farmers use is safe, and all the evidence done by peer-reviewed scientists show it's unsafe. And we need to get that message across. And the way to beat this is to buy organic food. That way we know that children are safe. The fact is, the evidence shows that within 4 days of eating organic food, these pesticides leave our bodies, leave our children's bodies. And that is the best way to minimize the risk. And I want to say this clearly. Organic food is the way to ensure our health. Thank you.
In fact, if you're serious about your health, then you need to eat organic. It's not an option if you're serious about your health. And it's not just the research that your blood will be cleaner. We surveyed 3,256 people who switched to non-GMO and largely organic diets, and they got better from 28 different conditions. 85% improved their digestion, then fatigue, then obesity and brain fog, anxiety, depression, chemical or food sensitivities, memory, concentration, and that was all 50% or higher. This is something that the doctors who are now prescribing organic diets are predicting because it is so consistent. Within days, they see a revolution in the person's health. So this is not an abstract thing, oh yeah, these things are dangerous, oh, there's a lot of things that are dangerous. This is the main point, that if you're serious about your health, you have to be serious about eating food without poison. And if you feel that you can't afford it, I'd like to recommend adding your medical budget, your health budget, and your philanthropy budget so that you're contributing to a healthier world at the same time. So if you're serious about personal health, to me, it's eating organic. If you're serious about global health, then it's keeping the GMOs in the laboratory. Now, we can talk about pesticides as well, but my focus here is the fact that GMOs with gene editing is so cheap and easy, and that everything with DNA is being targeted right now. If we don't stop it, future generations will not inherit the products of the billions of years of evolution, but instead products of laboratory creations whose number one most common outcome is surprise side effects. That is an existential threat to our future that we cannot allow to let happen. A Hawaiian prophecy was given by a person who told my friend it directly that around now is the time to catch the world and stand it up right. Otherwise, it'll be the end of biological evolution as we know it. So that is absolutely essential if we're serious about the survival and health of our planet.
I named the last chapter in my book Extreme Makeover, and by that I meant that we need to give the beauty industry a makeover, and the pesticide industry, the oil and the war industries too, until there are no more toxic chemicals in every baby born on Earth, until all children everywhere are born with the chance to survive and thrive, and ecosystems have a chance to survive in all species. And when I wrote that now 12 years ago, it was kind of a fringe perspective. And now, 12 years later, for followers of science, it's clear that we have no choice, actually, but to recreate our entire economy. And we know that from climate science and science about how insect populations are crashing, and the bees are dying, and the soil is decimated. And people who are fighting so hard to keep these systems going, and they work hard to do it, are coming from an insane perspective, and they don't see it yet. So how can we make them see it? And I want to add to all of that we also have to give the government an extreme makeover, and this is probably the most important and the hardest task of all. It's easy to think about how we can recreate the economy because people can make money doing that, and they are, right? Selling great products and making organic food, and absolutely we need to make those transitions and support them with our money. But we also need a government that uses our collective resources to protect our health. And we need to fight for that. And there's so much division right now over politics and who wants to even deal with it, but we have to. It's another thing about which we have no choice. And as I talk today about the systems of propaganda that are incredibly sophisticated, coming at us from all angles, these stories of how we have to not only keep things the same, but double down on industrial pesticide-heavy agriculture and double down on GMOs and double down on a toxic, addicted to toxin system. These stories take so much to hold up, but that same amount of effort is going into keeping us divided and disengaged about politics. And so part of all of our task moving forward is to take this on, to take back our government systems, and they are frustrating, and make them work for us to protect health. As Andre said, a situation where we're allowing kids to get exposed to things we know are hurting them. It's absolutely unacceptable. And there are a lot of good people in government, good scientists who tried to raise the alarms about this, who've been thrown out. We now have a government that's entirely dominated by pesticide, oil, and coal lobbyists. Every single health agency in this country right now is just straight up run by industry lobbyists. And that's kind of new. Now, I mean, it's really obvious. It's worse than it's ever been, but it's been that way for decades through every administration going back to at least Reagan. So we have a big chance this year in our country to start to change the government. And I hope we'll all vote, get registered, check to make sure you are registered, that your friends are registered, and get out there and vote in November and organize for the candidate that you love, and stop fighting with each other and start talking to each other about what we're for, what we believe in, and the world that we see as possible to create.
Well, first, the bad news. We live in a toxic food culture. We all know this. And right now, chronic disease is taking the lives, it's causing 7 out of every 10 deaths in the United States. We're talking about heart disease, cancer, Alzheimer's, diabetes. These are conditions that are not something where you go to a doctor and you get healed. They're a condition that most people are living with until the end of their lives. And right now, chronic disease is bankrupting us. The United States is spending $3.5 trillion this year on what we call medical care. But really, we all know it's disease symptom management. And of that $3.5 trillion, 9 out of 10 patients in that system that are, $9 out of $10 are going to treat people who have at least one major chronic lifestyle-caused illness. So the costs of our medical system are overwhelming, and we can argue, and political candidates can argue all they want about who should pay for what, but we're not going to be able to afford any of it unless we make some fundamental changes to why we are spending so much on managing the symptoms of disease. And it all comes back to diet and lifestyle. 2% of the children in the United States in high school get enough vegetables. 9% get enough fruits. And the average doctor in all of their years of medical training gets less than 19 hours of education that has anything to do with diet. And of that, they're mostly learning about specific reductionist disease patterns tied to specific nutrient deficiencies, not about how to help patients eat well. But I think this is all good news. Because as bad as things are, that's how much better they can be with a change. And can you imagine how much health we could liberate, how much vitality we could liberate, how many more people could be so much happier and more joyous if they knew what we're learning here? If they were able to eat right and live right and apply the principles of healthy eating in their lives? Can you imagine how much money we could save? Can you imagine how many resources we could save? The toxic food culture is something that is sickening not just to the consumer, but also to the provider. Farm workers do not like spraying toxic pesticides in the fields. Factory farm operators do not like slitting the throats of animals. They do not like cutting the beaks off of chickens so they won't pick each other to death while they're driven insane in horrendous conditions. They don't like pumping livestock full of antibiotics just to keep them alive under terrible conditions. I've talked to executives from Coca-Cola and Nestle, and they don't stay up all night trying to figure out how to poison our kids. They're trying to get by. They're trying to make it in a system that they feel is constantly pulling them towards a profit motive. So we've got to change that system, and it all starts with the dollars we spend, and every dollar we spend, every bite we take is a vote. So let's make that vote a conscious one, a deliberate one. Let's vote for the health we want, and let's vote for the world we want.
Hi. So first of all, I'd like to thank Steve Shore and the other people who organized this wonderful conference. When Steve asked us the question and we were all supposed to answer it, I thought whoever hit the button first would then give the right answer, as if it was Jeopardy or some other. And you have to put your answer in the form of a question. So for me, both Democrats and Republicans are equal opportunity destroyers. Genetic engineering was introduced in a large degree under Clinton and Gore, who were the administration from Monsanto. They put Michael Taylor into office as the head of the FDA. The FDA also stands for direct action, meaning that's how we deal with it, through our own direct action with ourselves and our folks and our friends and the groups that we're part of. So that's the message I would convey, is that we have to organize with each other, as everybody here has been saying. We have to organize not only to feed ourselves individually, to improve our individual health, but to also care about the world, care about what's being done to people all around the world, and then ask, why is this happening? Why has every government in the world known about the dangers of glyphosate, say, and Monsanto's Roundup, and has still, years and years and years, has done nothing about it? How is that progressive mayor of New York City, Bill de Blasio, still keeping spraying of Roundup in New York City parks, although I think that's going to come to an end soon? How is it that Hillary Clinton traveled around the world as the spokesperson for genetic engineering, and nobody thinks about that or talks about that? Or how Donald Trump or Ronald Reagan and all the others, Republicans and Democrats alike, put pesticides and genetic engineering on the front burner to move it forward as an industry to protect the profits of the corporations that were supporting them. This is all a question that we have to ask ourselves, and we also have to ask ourselves, I believe, what do we do when we win a victory, such as getting rid of Monsanto's glyphosate? It looks like that's going to happen somewhere along the way soon, but then they're coming right back with dicamba. They're coming right back with another pesticide or another synthesized creation that they're doing in the lab. What do we do about that? How do we organize when they finally banned DDT in early 1960s, and Rachel Carson heroically stood out there and wrote the defining Silent Spring, one of the defining books of our time, and a mass movement was formed to fight against DDT and eventually won. And I also wanted to say that it was a movement largely of women at the time as well, who were combined the issue of DDT. Remember, Rachel Carson didn't look at just DDT alone. She looked at the radiation that was coming from nuclear bomb tests and the Cold War with Russia, and how the strontium-90 was poisoning the milk supply that was going into the kids and the children, and so that these issues became combined. So nobody thought these were two separate issues. Everybody said these were the same, although history now has sort of separated them so that we only think of DDT and not also the nuclear arms race. But these two are combined issues. And so I think we need to think in that context. One last thing, Henry Kissinger famously said to give food aid to people just because they are starving is a pretty weak reason. That's Henry Kissinger, the author of much of the U.S. policy. I think he accurately reflected what the U.S. policy is on these issues, and it is immoral, and it is just awful that we have this. And so we have to see why, what is it that they were giving food aid for? Every food aid that's given now to the earthquake victims, to the tsunami victims, all is filled with genetically engineered and pesticided grains and food to dump it on those markets. And we have to deal with that and put our own individual hunger, feeding ourselves, concern about ourselves into that context and see how we could unite with people all over the world, not only here, to fight against this monster.
It sounds very good, but when I read the paper, it does seem to sort of brainwash me that I say to myself, well, I've read a lot of stuff about GMOs and pesticides and chemicals and modern agriculture that's very, very disturbing, but I'm not really an expert, and they keep telling me that we have all these 7 billion plus people and that we have to have the chemicals or we can't grow enough food to feed the world. And you know, and that just because I'm an American, I'm not thinking about the poor people in Laos and Cambodia that need food. So can we, without chemicals, pesticides, GMOs, and modern agriculture, are you sure we can grow enough food to feed the world?
Thanks. This is another example of disinformation put out by the pesticide industry. In fact, the word we use for them now are the poison cartels. That includes pesticides and GMOs. The world at the moment produces 3 times the amount of food we need to feed the world. At the same time, despite 70 years of industrial agriculture, of using pesticides and fertilizers, we have more food insecure people on this planet than any time in history. Over 850 million people are food insecure. What we mean by food insecure is that there are times of the year where they go to bed hungry, where children don't eat for days. On top of that, we have another billion people. Technically, they get enough calories, but they're empty calories. They don't get enough minerals or vitamins. For instance, in India, we see at least 200 million women who suffer from iron deficiencies, others who suffer from beta-carotene deficiencies. So there's almost half the world's population that are undernourished, despite the fact we produce 3 times the amount of food. On the other side of the equation, we have more people who are actually seriously overweight and obese than those people who are undernourished. The problem isn't one of food production, it is a problem of distribution. Being able to grow more food in Kansas or in Australia or knocking down more of the Amazon to grow GMO soybeans does not feed the world and never has. Most of these people who are food insecure are in the developing nations like Cambodia, like Africa, like Argentina or Peru. How do we feed them? We feed them with local organic systems. And I know from experience, because I was the president of the International Organization for the Organic Movement. And in our time, 2 United Nations organizations did a study looking at organic programs in Africa. And this looked at over 2.5 million acres where we put in organic agriculture with over 1 million farmers and 160 projects. And where we worked with these traditional farmers, we increased their yield by more than 100%. We took these populations from going hungry for several months of the year into food security, not only that, into prosperity. We changed the lives of these communities. We've done this in Asia, we've also done this in Latin America. So we don't need GMOs, we don't need pesticides. All we need is simple training and education on existing good organic practices, we will double the food supply in the areas that need it and actually get it where it is needed. And the irony is we could do that. We could end food insecurity tomorrow for less than the cost that it takes to develop one GMO.
I also wanted to add that a lot of our prime farmland in America is used not even to grow food. This GMO corn and soy used for ethanol, goes to cows, goes to processed foods. So it's a system that's really, as Mitchell was saying, you know, feeding children is not a good reason to grow food. That really is aligned with the thinking of these companies. I talked earlier about Jeff Simmons from Elanco. He's a great evangelist for how we need to double down on today's industrial food system. We need to double down on factory farms, get more animals in these farms. They're genetically engineering animals to fit better in confined feeding operations. I mean, these are the sorts of what's behind these ideas of we need to feed the 9 billion. It's a hashtag, it's a YouTube channel, it's Instagram, it's Twitter, and you'll find videos of this guy, Jeff, giving very impassioned speeches about how producing more is about feeding more. But as Andre said, that's absolutely opposite of the facts. And we need to be using our farmland to grow food that feeds people and not corporate profits.
I do want to add a couple notes of sobriety. We do have a growing human population. We are on course with current trends that we will need to produce more food in the next 50 years than we have in all of human history for humans up to this point. And that does take a toll on our farmland, and our current agricultural system is so unsustainable that we are eroding our topsoil, we are depleting our aquifers, we are destabilizing our climate, and we only have 60 years of farmable soil left on planet Earth. UN researchers estimate that by the year 2050, at current trends, we'll have half the growable land per capita, per human on Earth that we did in 1950. So we are on a collision course, if you look at those trends, with less and less farmland that works, less and less water, less and less climate stability, and more people. And it is alarming and it is concerning. And I want to be real about that. And in the very short term, current mass production systems produce a lot of calories per acre with a lot of pesticides very unsustainably. However, we're wasting most of these calories by feeding them to livestock. In the United States, we feed most of our corn and soy to livestock. Worldwide, 83% of agricultural land is used in livestock production. It produces 18% of the world's calories, 37% of the world's protein, but over 80% of the world's agricultural land. In fact, if you took all of the agricultural land currently being used for livestock, and the world just theoretically went vegan, we would free up an area of land equal to the United States, China, India, the European Union, and all of Australia combined. That's how much land we would save. So we'd have a lot of space then to do stuff, like maybe get a little bit less yield per acre to have a way more nutritional profile, to have organically grown food, to focus on vegetables rather than just corn and soy and super high volume products. We would have way more land that we could turn back into forests, so we could sequester carbon out of the atmosphere, or put up solar panels or windmills or all sorts of other stuff that we could do with that land. So I think that it is insincere for people to say that we must do this pesticide, GMO, unsustainable treadmill that mortgages the future of our planet and our children so that we can produce maximal yield right here and now while feeding massive amounts of grain and soy to livestock, and then to think that that makes any sense whatsoever. So we as consumers can eat lower on the food chain, and then we can eat more organic, and we can absolutely walk with dignity and say, I am creating a safer world and a healthier world and a more sustainable world, and I am having a smaller ecological footprint, and it takes less land to grow my food than most of the people around me, and it is more sustainable, and by the way, it's a whole lot healthier.
And
Well, I
by the way,
remember- Oh, yeah, Jeff.
I'll just say one sentence. GMOs don't increase average yield, as opposed to organic, which can double yield.
Absolutely. And if we stopped facilitating the development of huge tracts of land, as Ocean was talking about, for export crops and for monocropping, genetically engineered crops for animal feed, we would have more than enough land to feed the people of the world. People would be able to feed ourselves or themselves. We wouldn't need to think of us feeding them or something like that. And there would be plenty of space for which people can reclaim the land and start developing the kind of crops that they need locally to eat, instead of being shunted off the land into export zones to produce. In Haiti, it was to produce clothing. We had documents from the International Monetary Fund back in the 80s where it was one of the only smoking gun documents that I ever saw, in which they consciously said in writing that our goal is to remove 1/3 of the peasantry from the land, move them into export zones, and then take over that land to produce coffee and export crops for U.S., China, Japan, elsewhere. So, yeah, so that's that's a policy issue of the United States and other countries, and we need to affect that policy. I remember, anybody here remember when Ronald Reagan was on TV and he said, ketchup, oh, that's a vegetable. And that stuck in my mind all these years, because he was using that to say, oh, little kids in school are getting well fed. They have ketchup. They have vegetables. What are you talking about? So I kind of think that mindset is a similar mindset to some of the approaches that are being taken today. Even Jimmy Carter, he's written extensive articles in favor of genetic engineering, using exactly this question of there won't be enough food to feed the world, so we need to feed them genetically engineered and grow genetically engineered food. Jeff is right with his simple answer. Maybe I should keep mine as short as yours from now on. It was great. It was right. It doesn't increase yield, so what are we talking about?
Can I just speak to this as well? At the moment, most of the Amazon and other areas are being cleared for genetically modified soy. And this is actually being mostly shipped to China and to the European Union to feed animals in confined animal feeding operations, CAFOs. I prefer to call them animal concentration camps, because they are the equivalent of the Dachau Auschwitzes of animals. But in terms of feeding the world, for every 10 tons of vegetable protein, you produce 1 ton of animal protein. How inefficient is that? Not only on one side, we are destroying some of our world's most precious biodiversity. On the other side, we are creating incredible animal cruelty. In the middle, we're transporting this material, for unbelievable distances and causing climate change. And the net outcome is we need to produce 10 times as much protein as the protein we eat. It is idiocy. There is no logic. How, you say we need genetically modified crops so we can continue to do this. It is beyond logic. There is no need for this. It's all about profits and nothing else.
And I'd just like to add, if folks want to do more research to really get a good handle on this, then one of the best resources out there is the farming systems trial that's been done at the Rodale Institute now for, I believe, about 35 years running, where there's been side-by-side conventional or organic crops that have been maintained for 35 years. It's been done in parallel. And it's just astounding to look at the results. You can see the research summary, or you can go into more depth and actually look at what's happened there. And part and parcel of that, in terms of trying to understand how we make sure that we're moving forward in positive ways with organic agriculture, only 0.01% of research acres in the United States is dedicated to organic production. 0.01%, and that's it. I'd like to challenge us to find a way to have one land grant institution in this country find a way to replicate some of these studies and to further advance the research that's needed in terms of organic agriculture instead of the other percent, which is just totally overwhelming, the fact that all the rest of the research is being dedicated to conventional agriculture.
I know some very smart people, and I've said to them, there's a lot of information on GMOs and pesticides and the modern food system that's very clear that this is very problematic, and there's health issues and environmental issues, and I would be and I'm concerned about it, and maybe you should consider not eating foods with pesticides and GMOs. And they've said to me very clearly, no, there's no scientific proof. So is there scientific proof, and how much of it, that GMOs and pesticides are bad for us? What is the proof? Why are you all so convinced that there's proof? What is the proof? What's the proof? How much proof is there? I mean, what do we say when people say there's no proof?
First, there is proof, but a very important point is the burden of proof is not supposed to be on the people who have concerns anyway. The burden of proof by law in the United States and the European Union, which are both supposed to be upholding the precautionary principle when it comes to food safety. By the way, people usually don't know that about the U.S. Our U.S. food safety law since 1958 has strongly instituted the precautionary principle, more strongly actually than has the European Union. So according to the precautionary principle, and according to all sound policy, the people that are introducing new technologies that many scientists recognize as having the potential to cause great harm, and when there is not scientific evidence of safety, the burden of proof is supposed to be on the people introducing the new technology or the new additives. And that burden has been shifted in the case of GMOs and was shifted very early on in the genetic engineering venture, even well before genetic engineering was even able to move into agriculture. It was very difficult to move from genetically engineering bacteria to creating a genetically engineered plant. The proponents would have you believe it was very simple. It wasn't. Several barriers had to be broken. DNA had to be rewritten. Genes had to actually be rewritten before bacterial genes could function within the cells of plants. Many other changes had to happen as well. So the burden of proof was surreptitiously shifted and illegally shifted, and it has remained shifted, and people don't even understand that. So first, we meaning anybody with concerns, the burden shouldn't be on us to prove that these foods are unsafe. The burden should be on the manufacturers to demonstrate they're safe, and that burden has never been met. But secondly, to the extent the solid research has been done, and especially research by independent scientists, and by that I mean scientists that are independent of the financial or other influence of the corporations that are making the foods, or independent of the drive to prove these foods are safe no matter what, the good research has raised not only several doubts, but demonstrated that a number of genetically engineered foods have caused serious harm to the laboratory animals that were unfortunate enough to end up in the experimental groups rather than the control groups in the experiments. They ate the GMOs, they got sick. Their livers and or their kidneys were harmed, or their pancreases, or their pituitary glands, or they got severe gastric inflammation. There are many, many different harms that have been documented. So these claims, and you will read claims by the UK Royal Society, by the United States National Academy of Science, that there's no evidence of any harm ever coming from a single genetically engineered food. That's just false. It is a misstatement of the scientific record. There are many studies in the peer-reviewed scientific literature that have documented significant harm to the unfortunate animals that were put in the experimental group. And unfortunately, the population of the US, Canada, Argentina, and many other countries has been put in, and I won't say the experimental group because it's not even an experiment. There's no epidemiological data being gathered. So people could be getting sick now from GMOs, through cancer, through Crohn's disease, from many other common ailments, and we would not know it, and we probably could never know it because of the shoddy way that the shoddy lack of follow-up. So when people say, well, there's an experiment going on the population, no, it's not an experiment. It's just imposition of high-risk foods. But it's not an experiment because nobody's going to learn anything from it the way they're going.
There has been plenty of evidence showing that GMOs and pesticides are harmful. I have a peer-reviewed published article that you can review at Non-GMO Improves Health, and it has 200 citations, and it talks about a lot of the research that Stephen just talked about. And if you go to Non-GMO Improves Health, there's also a free copy of my book, Genetic Roulette, which at 2007 was the full compilation of all the health risks from GMOs, and there's a video of some updates of some of the problems that they've discovered since then. So that's available in case someone says there's no evidence. You can go there and there's the evidence.
Could you just repeat that again, where the evidence is?
It's non-GMOimprovehealth.com. And you can, again, get the free book, the free update, an interview with the doctor who sees what's happening with the children, plus a summary of the peer-reviewed article and the full 26-page article with all the citations.
You know, thanks, Jeff. You know that when they studied Roundup, so supposedly studied it, they didn't study it. When they approved of Roundup, the testing was done only on glyphosate, one of the ingredients, supposedly the active ingredient, but it's not the only active ingredient. But that was what they did all the testing on. So now it turns out, just in the past year or two, that Roundup also contains POEAs, or surfactants, that allow the penetration of chemicals past the plant coatings and into the plant itself. And the same thing in human beings. It violates different biological pathways in our bodies. And it also contains, thanks to Seralini's research, arsenic. And how did that happen? How come Monsanto didn't inform the FDA of that? And how come the FDA didn't question it or do their own study on it? So to piggyback on what Philip was saying, and everybody else as well, the precautionary principle is imperative, that we have to fight to make sure that before chemicals are introduced into our environment, that they're proven safe first, not afterwards when they see, oh, how many people died from this or that. I know in 1999, New York City, under Mayor Giuliani, began spraying malathion, which is an organophosphate, all over the city, from the air. I was in Prospect Park. The helicopters came. They sprayed the entire park. And little kids out there, everybody was getting drenched in this stuff. We're running around trying to get kids out of the park as quickly as we can. And where was the study beforehand to say that you can spray this on little kids, let alone everybody else? None. And yet they went ahead and did that anyway. So I do think that morality is a really important issue here, in addition to the economic factors and the political factors that we've been talking about. The morality of it needs to be first and foremost as well. And I think people here are very moral, and we're here and concerned, and we're going to not let this happen anymore, right?
Can I just say one thing? I just want to just speak on the spraying of the malathion. That was for the West Nile virus. And that is now used as a classic example of, if you want to spread a disease and make sure that you spread it far and wide, what Giuliani did then in New York City did was the perfect way, because now West Nile virus is all over the US. Because all the malathion did is disperse the mosquitoes and made sure they left New York City to go to greener pastures. And I think that's actually one of the other things I just want to say here, one of the mythologies about pesticides. When DDT was invented, the inventor of DDT got the Nobel Prize, because what would in those days used to lose about 8% of crops to pesticides, to insect damage. And this would increase food security by 8%. So they gave him the Nobel Prize for that. Now it's close to 21% loss, between 16 and 21% loss with pesticides. This mythology that pesticides stop pests is wrong. It's the other way around. It's the same with Roundup Ready crops are going to stop weeds. Now there are super weeds because of resistance. And that is the other issue with these things. It is not the solution that they make it out to be. It's turned out to be exactly the opposite.
I think it bears mention that in California, where I live, there are farm worker communities where cancer is so epidemic that the children shave the heads off of their Barbie dolls while they're playing with them, because that's what they're used to seeing, is people who are going through chemotherapy and have no hair. And the life expectancy in the farm worker community in the state of California is, by one estimate, 49 years. There are a lot of factors that go into that, but you would think with cancer developing late in life, typically the cancer rates would thus be low, but actually cancer rates are epidemic in farm worker communities. Why? Well, obviously because people are spraying pesticides in the fields every day. So they're like the canaries in the coal mine, in a sense. For the rest of us, they're on the front lines day in and day out, and they're bringing it back to their families and their children. And we all eat in a way that either fuels that or fuels something else. But we can certainly see what's happening to them and say, my goodness, if it's bad for them, it's probably not good for the rest of us either. And the other piece I would add is we call these pesticides as if they kill, side is death, right? Pests. And it's actually multiple classes. So pesticides includes insecticides and fungicides and herbicides. But really, they're all biocides. They don't just kill that one thing, they kill life. Glyphosate is patented as an antibiotic. These things all kill various life forms, and they don't just stop at the so-called target. So even though, as we're hearing, they're not very effective at those targets, in fact, they produce resistance and in the long run create more problems, but they also have all kinds of other impacts on bees, on monarch butterflies, on our water, on our ecosystems, and ultimately, of course, on our children.
I want to add also just the idea of this concept of proof, that we need science to prove something, and then therefore we can take action. All of the things that Ocean just mentioned about the farm workers, that's incredibly important. And someone might say, but it's not proof. You can't prove it, therefore it's not true. But that's not how science works. Science is a tool that can give us clues that we can then choose to listen to or not as part of a very complex system. And the science on neonicotinoids, for example, is there proof that neonics are killing bees? Well, there's multiple lines of evidence from studies in the lab, studies in the field, beekeeper observations, many different ways of knowing that pesticides are a key contributing factor to bee declines. But it's not that the pesticides are necessarily outright killing the bees. What seems to be occurring, what the science is pointing to, is that it weakens the bees. And then they're much more susceptible to other problems, pests, pathogens, climate change, whatever. So we're living in complex systems with science that's looking at tiny slivers of it and trying to tell us what's what. We have to take the science and add to it common sense and observations, what's happening to farm workers, why are farmers getting cancer at higher rates all across the country. And also, science needs to come out of its little box and have the toxicologists talking to the biologists, talking to the ecologists, trying to figure out really how can we assess what's happening in these complex ecologies in which we live. And so in Europe, they do take the precautionary approach where they looked at the science on neonics and they said, that's enough for us. We're going to temporarily ban them, and then now they've made permanent bans. That plus also the beekeepers rose up, protests in the streets, they're not having it. And we don't have that culture here in the US. We're allowing our government to tell us you need absolute proof before you can take action to ban a chemical. Under the law, that's what it's. Well, guess what? They can't even reach that level of proof with asbestos, which has a disease named after it. And the government tried to ban it, and they took it to court, and they lost in court. You can't do that. It doesn't rise to the level of proof. So for anyone who says prove it, I would say, you got to make your own choices. Look at the science and look at the world around us, and then make wise choices about what you think it means and how we might take action to protect ourselves.
In my book, I quote from a molecular geneticist, Michael Antonio, who's at King's College London. He's not opposed to genetic engineering per se. In fact, he uses it in his research. His research is geared to trying to understand and cure human genetic diseases. But because he uses the process of genetic engineering, he understands how risky it can be and how it has the potential for unintended side effects. And so when it comes to using that technology for producing foods, he's concerned, as are many other well-credentialed scientists. In fact, he knows the research, he's studied the research better than most scientists. He's written about it. And here's the statement he has made about the research, which I think is quite telling and quite chilling. If the kind of detrimental effects seen in animals fed GE food, that's genetically engineered food, were observed in a clinical setting, the product's use would be halted and further research instigated to determine the cause and to find solutions. However, what repeatedly happens in the case of GE food is that despite increasing evidence of serious adverse health test results, government and industry continue unabated with the development, endorsement, and marketing these foods as if nothing has happened, to the point they even seem to ignore the results of their own research. There is clearly a pressing need for independent research into the potential ill effects of GE food, and this research must include extensive animal and human feeding trials. That last point is very important. There have not yet been any human feeding trials, as in the case of pharmaceutical drugs. There haven't even been adequate animal tests yet, let alone moving on to human clinical trials. And many experts, including the expert panel of the Royal Society of Canada that released an extensive report on genetically engineered foods as far back as 2001, were criticizing the lax regulatory regimes in Canada, the US, and the EU, saying it's scientifically unjustifiable to presume that any genetically engineered food is safe based on the kinds of tests that were done, and calling for strong tests, including human clinical trials, and the kinds of tests they called for have yet to be instituted in any nation.
like to ask you 6 questions, and you could tell me if they're related, or you can answer whichever one you want. You could tell me if there's a relation between all 6 of these questions. Question 1 is, in 1860, the average age of the onset of puberty in girls was 16.6 years. In 1920, it was 14.6. In 1950, 13.1. 1980, 12.5, 12 and a half years old. And in 2010, it had dropped to 10 and a half years old. That was from 16.6, 16 and a half years old in 1860 to 10 and a half in 2010. Similar sets of figures have been reported for boys, albeit with a delay of around a year. So what is causing the earlier age of the onset of puberty? That's question 1. Question 2 is, I heard Stephanie Senoff from MIT say that 1 out of 2 children would have autism by 2032. Now, it's possible that she's updated this statement since I read it, but so she said that, and I guess so that's the second question. What's that based on? Third question is, the first global assessment of pollinators ever has found that extinction pressures on species that facilitate crop production are threatening the world's food supply, with hundreds of billions of dollars worth of food and agricultural production annually at stake. Fourth question is, sperm counts have dropped over 50% since 1973, according to the New York Times. And fifth question, is it true that the FDA has only banned 7 out of 80,000 chemicals introduced? And I'll add a sixth question, is it true that only 1 in 4 food samples tested contain 0 pesticides, meaning that 3 out of 4 food samples contain 0 pesticides? So to repeat, the first one was about puberty, the second one was about pollinators, the third was about autism, the fourth was about sperm counts, the fifth was about only 7 out of 80,000 chemicals introduced ever being banned, and the sixth was that 3 out of 4 food samples had 0 pesticides. Answer whatever you want from that and tell me if there's a relation of why all these things are happening. Your thoughts?
I could answer 3 of them in one go. The answer is, number one, let's start with the residues in food samples, and that less than a quarter have no residues. The reason I will say that is false is because when all the testing I've seen, no government or anyone has tested for every pesticide used. They only test for a sample of the thousands that are approved, and they don't test also for the breakdown products that can be more toxic. So, for instance, to give you an example, here in the US, the most common pesticide used is glyphosate, but at this stage, not one official testing has ever tested for glyphosate. So to say that 25% of samples do not have pesticides when you do not test for all the samples and some of the most common ones means that's not true. You've got no evidence that those 25% don't have any testing. And when the USDA started the testing, they found so much glyphosate they could not find a sample without it. They stopped testing and didn't want to publish it. So the fact is, where we take these samples to independent labs and start to test them, and also test them not at parts per million, but at the real rates that affect us, parts per billion and parts per trillion, we find every sample has not just one, but multiple pesticides. So, firstly, then we talk about the age of puberty in girls and also the falling sperm counts. They are all related to the same issue that we know of over 800 chemicals that when they go to very low levels, parts per billion and parts per trillion, they start to act like hormones. Part per trillion is the equivalent of 1 drop of water in 3 Olympic-sized swimming pools. And many of these chemicals act like synthetic estrogens. And what that is doing is causing girls to reach puberty earlier because they're actually being exposed to excess estrogen from the time they are conceived all through their life. And where this is a real concern, we know there is a relationship between the onset of breast cancer, between increase in breast cancer and early onset of puberty. The earlier a girl reaches puberty, the more likely her chances are of breast cancer. And the fact is that 80% of breast cancers are what we call estrogen sensitive. Estrogen increases it. Similarly, the fact that boys are being exposed to excess estrogen is affecting their development. We're finding higher levels of boys being born with urinary genital tract deformities, a whole range of them. And we know also that this is also affecting their sperm counts, but not just the drop in sperm counts, but the quality of the sperm, the motility, there's more sperm deformities. This is a real issue in terms of not just falling reproduction, but in terms of birth defects in children. And we also know that these same chemicals are responsible for the increase in cancers of the sexual tissues, breast cancer, ovarian cancer, cervical cancer, endometrial cancer, and in men, prostate and testicular cancer.
Adding to that, and thank you for that, Andre, the falling rates of puberty, and I mean not only, and that's a dramatic dropping rate of early puberty hitting girls. Not only do they have a higher risk of breast cancer, but multiple social problems and difficulties hitting puberty so early. And there's a wonderful report about it that I wanted to mention that was done by a scientist called Sandra Steingraber. She's a wonderful scientist. The report is, difficult, like a lot of this information, but she looked at all the factors contributing to early puberty, and there are multiple factors: sedentary lifestyles, not just pesticides or direct chemical exposures in the home of the endocrine disruptors, but also polluted communities seem to be harder hit, as always with these issues. The communities where they're making the chemicals or running the factories are dealing with the worst health and environmental problems, and they're often communities of color. So early puberty is a huge problem, and the dropping sperm counts is stunning how the numbers on that. In fact, they changed the numbers so it doesn't look so stunning. But they have actually, what does dropping mean? But there was a study recently in the Journal of American Medical Association, JAMA. And I was shocked by this because it's a leading medical journal in the US, so it's really the gold standard according to a lot of doctors. And there was a commentary in there by Philip Landrigan from Mount Sinai, who said there are multiple lines of evidence that pesticides in food are leading to all sorts of fertility problems, and that his advice to doctors is to tell your patients to eat organic. And there was a study also in the journal. It was a small study done by Harvard researchers where they looked at, they studied women undergoing IVF, in vitro fertilization. So they were having trouble getting pregnant. And they put some of them on an organic diet, and some of them ate conventional food. And they reported that there was a higher rate of pregnancy loss among the women who were eating a conventional diet, and that organics seemed to matter in terms of them having successful fertility treatments. And the doctors who did that, he said he was really surprised. He was not expecting the results to be that way. And a reporter asked him, would you change anything now about your own behavior? He said, I might be more willing to eat an organic apple. So the information is in the mainstream, and I think that's really good news and important to show how strong the evidence actually is. Another of the questions was about the EPA banning chemicals. I thought it was 5, not 7, but maybe it's updated. But 5 classes of chemicals have been banned, and I mentioned they were unable to ban asbestos. But that's under the industrial chemical laws, and pesticides are regulated somewhat differently, so it's easier to get pesticides regulated and banned. And we were about to ban chlorpyrifos, but the Trump administration stopped that, which happened to be after Dow gave $1 million to the inauguration.
Can I just want to say one other thing about falling sperm counts in organic food. There was a study done in Denmark. They thought if pesticides are the cause, they wanted to look at a group of men who weren't exposed to pesticides. So they got a whole lot of Danish organic farmers to volunteer to give sperm samples, and their sperm samples were the same as their grandfathers, the equivalent of the 1930s. So that, I think, is really important evidence to put across that there is good evidence that it's pesticides, and there's also good evidence that by going on an organic diet and avoiding them, we can get sperm samples back, sperm levels back to the way they should be. And this is very important for the health of our civilization. What sort of civilization allows, our reproduction to be so damaged as it is now, and particularly when we have good science that we can turn it around in weeks, even days.
In the film Secret Ingredients that I did with Amy Hart, there's a chiropractor that sees a lot of infertile couples, and she puts them all on an organic diet, and 100% of them have children. The last time I checked, it was 123 couples out of 123. And many of them had been through fertility clinics without success for years. But I actually wanted to talk about the autism question. Also in the film, there's 2 families with autistic boys. They switched to organic, and the boys are no longer on the spectrum. In my other film, Genetic Roulette, there are 3 parents of autistic boys. They also talk about the vast improvements in their children when they switch to organic. There's a pediatrician, Michel Perrault, who's in the both films. He talks about how switching diets can have a dramatic improvement for autistic children. It certainly doesn't happen to every child, but it's certainly worth trying. Now, as far as Stephanie Seneff's research, she's a good friend, and she can analyze big data in a fantastic way. She's a PhD and MIT researcher. And she wanted to crack the solution for autism, so she pulled all the data on autism and found all of what was going on in the physiology. And she said to me, I can tell you why the children are having those symptoms based on their physiological changes, but I couldn't at the time tell you what the environmental insult was to create those changes. So she pulled all the data down of all of the dangerous pesticides and chemicals that she knew about to look to see if that was causing the pattern of changes in the autistic children. And none of them fit. Then she went to a lecture by another friend of mine, Dr. Don Huber, a professor emeritus from Purdue University who is an expert on glyphosate. And she told me she sat at the edge of her chair for 2 hours because everything he said made sense. She had found the chemical. She knew by the time she left that lecture that this was the one that fit hand in glove with the autism data. And then she and another doctor, Nancy Swanson, thank you, who wrote you an article with,
Yeah, I'm the co-author.
and the co-author, and this guy over here, co-authored the paper where they took autistic data and they mapped it against the amount of Roundup sprayed on on soy and corn in the United States. And if it were 100% correlation, the R value would be 1. In this case, the R value was 0.9973. And it's interesting that so many people now in the autistic community have heard her speak and are now putting their children on an organic diet. And again, it does not have the effect on everyone, but for some, it is night and day. And it gives it a sense of one of the things that may be a result of this glyphosate nightmare.
Maybe if I could just add quickly, my temptation is certainly to move toward a yes, and yet at the same time, I think, we know not what we do, and I just wanted to put this in a little bit of context from the on-farm perspective, because when I was working in the fruit industry and orchards and vineyards in the 1980s and 1990s, there was a move toward what some of you may have heard, which is integrated pest management, or IPM as it's commonly known, and in German, integrierter Obstbau, which means integrated fruit production, which sounds great. It sounds like a good thing, but part of what was happening back in the prior to the 80s and 90s was, very often in orchards and vineyards, utilizing 4, 5, maybe 6 different pesticides in a given year. And then we moved toward something to deal with the resistance that was being shown there with regard to insects, various pests, and also diseases. And so the idea became to use a multitude of pesticides to prevent the resistance among the pests and the diseases. And in the process of doing that, what we've come to now is that you'll have vineyards and orchards and vegetable operations where you may have 20, 30, even in some cases 40 different pesticides in one year that are utilized in a particular orchard or vineyard. And so suddenly, we're living in this mass swirling cocktail of all these different pesticides, of these active ingredients. Those are the active ingredients, and as Andre said, that doesn't even include the so-called inactive ingredients. So I think it's important for us to realize the trends that have brought us in part to where we are and made all of this that much more confusing and difficult to analyze and figure out these pieces.
One of the things that Stephanie Seneff proposes is how glyphosate affects the human body. And it's a hypothesis that she's putting forth, that it's substitute for glycine in your DNA. And she talks about that. We published in my book that just came out. Stacy has a chapter in it also. Stephanie Seneff talks about how that actually works as a mechanism, as a potential mechanism, because it hasn't been confirmed yet. But if so, this would be pretty earth-shaking and also pretty simple, how this mechanism happens that ends up producing autism or other major problems in children. We also have, let's not forget that with factory farming and eating of animals, it's not only the pesticides, it's also the antibiotics that are put into the fish pools, and also in the other ways in which the slaughterhouses where animals are made to survive for a while, and then they're with the antibiotics, and then we consume it. And then we urinate it out eventually, and it ends up poisoning, the antibiotics poisoning the waters all around. And because we don't think holistically, we think of each thing as a separate piece, and we don't think of the totality of how one part affects the other part and interacts with it. And that's a major point also, I believe, that we need to begin thinking. What does it mean to think holistically, ecosystemically? What does that mean? And to ask ourselves that, and to always look for the hidden questions that we never think to ask, because we're taught not to think that way.
Just to speak more on the autism epidemic, and it is an epidemic, and it's still increasing. And we actually we know of a range of chemicals that we call neurotoxic that actually damage the developing nerve cells. And mercury, for instance, is one. There's very good evidence. And lead, but we also know that there are several pesticides that do it. And one of the very dangerous neurotoxic chemicals is chlorpyrifos, the one that the EPA was about to ban, and when Dow generously donated to Trump's inauguration, that chemical is no longer banned. But in terms of glyphosate, we have clear science now on how it causes autism. There's a very good study showing how it damages it affects one of the genes that's involved in the replication of nerves. And what happens is that as the nerves replicate, one part of a nerve is called an axon. And the axon is, as it develops like branches on a tree. And each of these branches are how nerves connect with other nerves, and in the brain builds the neural network. Small amounts of glyphosate stops this normal development, and when you look at the axons of nerves that have been exposed to small amounts of glyphosate, instead of looking like a tree branch, they just look like a half-dead tree with a couple of minor little branches. This means that the nerves are undeveloped. The brain is not making all the connections that should be needed for a brain to operate properly. So we now have clear science of the biochemical pathways, how glyphosate causes autism, but is probably responsible for attention deficit hyperactive disorder, for IQ loss, for the schizophrenia spectrum, and all the other basically epidemic of diseases that we are seeing in developing children. And based on that alone, not just cancer, that alone, glyphosate should have been banned. And I keep on saying this lack of banning these chemicals is some of the worst child abuse we are doing. If we were to hit a child, that's child abuse. If we had science and we know that we are damaging the brains of children, damaging their reproduction, and we're not doing anything about it, that is incredible child abuse. And I think this is one of the reasons why we need to be really angry about this.
A lot's already been said, so I won't repeat it. But I just want to take a moment to acknowledge the grief that I feel. I'm probably not the only one when I think about some of these statistics. And I think about where they lead us, 50% drop in sperm count. Average age of Menzies kids, 10, 11 years old. When I think about the impact of these statistics of the decline in our biosphere and our ecosystems, biological diversity, and the number of people who are living chronically sick, and obesity and overweight, now 70% of the population in this country, on forecast to be 90% in the next generation. And when we see so many of us living chronically sick and so many of our kids suffering, food allergy rates amongst our children have quintupled in the last generation. The number of kids who are hospitalized for a food allergy. So, it's not just in our heads or in some overprotective mom's mind that our kid's allergic to peanuts. No, the kid's really allergic to peanuts. And there's a lot of other stuff like that now. And so when I face these facts, and when we look at these facts, I just want to acknowledge that we can point at the villains and we can point at what we can do. And there's also a lot that is happening systemically that we can do a lot to reverse it. But you know what? Our environment is polluted, right? It's going to take time. Our gene pool is polluted. It's going to take time. And some of these genetically engineered crops will never be extinct from this earth because this is perpetuity. This is the gene pool being contaminated. And so I'm saying this not to depress, but because I actually want us to, I think we can only genuinely respond effectively to what we face when we genuinely face it. When we genuinely absorb the reality of where we are, that can also, I believe, give us the power, give us the courage, give us the capacity to effectively respond. And the truth is there's a lot of denial that sets in, because we don't want to face how much it hurts, because it's painful to face it. But I say that denial is actually the thief of action. It's actually the thief of courage. And so what I want to invite you, as you're hearing some of these facts, if you feel outraged, if you feel sad, if you feel concern, then I want to invite you to let that become a force that lives in you. Let that light a fire in you, because I believe that actually the responses we feel genuinely as real human beings to what we face are part of what will give us everything we need to do to discover what's possible. And that's, to me, the hope of the world.
Okay, I'd like to again ask a series of questions. Maybe you could comment on an individual one, or you could comment on how they're related. But I'd like to read you 8 questions, then you could pick one or just tell me if there's a relationship between them. So the first question is, are weeds becoming resistant to Roundup? What impact does that have on society if the weeds become resistant to Roundup? Please explain what that means. Question 2. You said if you introduce a GMO into the environment, the genes become a permanent feature of the gene pool. It gets passed on generation after generation. The only thing that lasts longer than a contaminated gene pool is extinction. Please explain that in greater detail. Question 3. Are GMOs crops contaminating all the non-GM crops, including organic crops? Please explain this. 4. Seed diversity is disappearing and 3 chemical companies own more than half. Our food security hinges on the struggle now underway over who controls the earth's seeds. Question 5. You said that 15 times more glyphosate is being used compared to before GMOs were introduced. Why is that happening, and what impact does that have on people? Number 6. Is Roundup or glyphosate in our food even if we avoid genetically modified foods? Question 7. Is it true that Russia has banned the planting of genetically modified seeds? What countries allow or don't allow the planting of genetically modified seeds? And finally, question number 8. There's been a dramatic reduction in the number of fruits and vegetables. Why does this matter? Why do we need 5,000 variety of apples? Aren't we fine with just 10? So if you want to comment on an individual one, great. If there's some relation between these that you want to make an overall statement about, that's fine as well.
You're killing us, Steve. That's tough. That's a tough line. I'm going to take just a couple. Try to explain weed resistance really quickly. So Roundup Ready, genetically engineered crops were introduced in the 90s. And most of the GMOs on the market right now are these weed-resistant crops. And the way they work is they engineer the plant to resist the chemical, mostly glyphosate. So glyphosate will kill everything green except a plant that is genetically engineered to resist it will survive that. So they introduced these crops. They were incredibly effective at selling glyphosate and Roundup use has gone way up since then. The weeds, because nature finds a way around, have become resistant. Yes, I mean, that's well documented. And the solution to that, the insane solution, I'm just going to name the insane system of addiction, but the insane solution to that is to genetically engineer crops to resist other chemicals too, dicamba, 2,4-D, some of the older chemicals, and to triple stack them. So they're spraying all these chemicals and the plants continue to resist. And then to double down on that insanity even more with the new genetically engineered crops, because genetic engineering has really made leaps and bounds to now where you can gene edit or quickly change the DNA of crops. One of the things they're looking at is genetically engineering or gene editing weeds to become more susceptible to Roundup. So it's a system that is not going to stop until we challenge it and call it insane is what it is. And the other thing I wanted to answer quickly is there Roundup in food that's non-GMO? Yes, 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 and that's very important. And in fact, some of the highest levels of Roundup may be in wheat, and that's because they have in beans, and as well as other things that are not genetically engineered. Really, corn and soy and a few other crops are GMO right now. But glyphosate is sprayed on wheat and other crops in a process called desiccation, basically to make it easier for farmers to harvest. So this crop's alive and they're dying at different rates. They just want to kill it all at the same time, so it's easier to harvest. And right before it gets consumed, so the levels are quite high. That process should just be banned and outlawed like tomorrow. But if you're looking to eat organic food, and I think especially for kids, I think about this a lot as a mom. Kids eat so much wheat, the white food diet, but really looking for organic food for kids and wheats, pastas, I think is really important.
I've spent 25 years answering those questions, Stephen. So I'm going to give some resources. To get a list of all of the studies that have been done on glyphosate levels in food, you can go to responsibletechnology.org. Every time some organization publishes any of them, we put them all together in one report so that you can figure out that if you can't get organic food, which foods do you want to avoid, like the chickpeas and the mung beans and the lentils and the oats and the wheat, etc. So that's at responsibletechnology.org. You also mentioned that the only thing that lasts longer than the self-propagating genetic contamination is extinction. You were quoting me. And you can find out about our plan to protect the irreversible contamination of the gene pool at another website called Protect Nature Now. There's a 3-minute film which you're welcome to steal and share with as many people as you want. It says go to protectnaturenow.com at the end, but if your organization doesn't like that, we'll give you an unbranded version and you can send them to your website and we'll give you all the resources on that site for you, because we need to protect nature now and we're not in competition. We need to all work together. I also want to make a comment on an earlier comment that Ocean, you mentioned. You've been really the heart of our panel in a couple of ways, just bringing up the deep feeling that you're experiencing. And you talked about the high rates of cancer among the farm workers. And you said, and then you sort of quietly said, and that sort of depends on, relates to our food choices. And I was really moved by that because, we hear about the fact that the farm workers live till 49, and we say, this is terrible, someone should do something. Well, the choosing of organic food is something that you can do. So when I said earlier, to afford organic, combine 3 budgets, your food budget, your health budget, and your philanthropy budget. This is, in a way, what I was talking about, so that we can create healthy food systems for the farm workers and for the environment. And if we think of this and these things are lively, we can carry this into our supermarkets. So when we see there's a price discrepancy between organic and non-organic, we can think in terms of those farm workers and not have to pay for them to deliver more pesticides and hurt their lives more as one of the excuses, and also living longer and healthier as another excuse. So I just wanted to comment on that because I thought that was beautiful.
So what's a weed? What's a pest? American Indian tribes used to use what today we call weeds as medicinal plants. Is it a weed? Should we try to exterminate it? Is the way we should deal with problems to try and exterminate, an organism? Or are there other holistic, again, ways of addressing these problems? What is a pest? Is a mosquito always a pest? What about when birds eat them, or frogs, or dragonflies? A dragonfly can eat 1,500 mosquitoes in an hour, which shocked me when I learned that statistic. It's amazing. So what may be a pest to us in the narrow way is actually feeding all sorts of beneficial, what we think of as beneficial organisms and insects and animals. So let's retool the way we think about these things. Also, it's interesting that you brought up farm workers. I'm glad you did, especially here on Long Island, because back in the 70s, back then, early 70s, I used to organize out on Long Island in the potato graders and the potato fields, and organizing the farm workers there. And we didn't organize so much around pesticides. That came a little bit later. We weren't thinking about that, but we were also thinking about the way farm workers also lived. and how a farm worker who was sorting potatoes, if you walked around Patchogue or out further in Cutchogue here on Long Island, you always found farm workers missing a finger or two fingers because they got caught in the machinery, or they lived in these shacks in which if they were found to have a potato to eat that they were just now sorting, they could face a prison term and a fine for that. Meanwhile, they had nothing at all to begin with. So they were, so all these things are connected. Yes, they're all connected, but they're also, I'm glad you brought that up, because part of when we're talking about pesticides or the strawberry fields or spraying the methyl bromide on the strawberries, which is total poison to people who are picking them. This is all part of it. How do people live, and how are they supposed to cope with these illnesses given the circumstances of their lives as they are today?
I think a number of these points have been well addressed. One that hasn't been touched on, you asked about essentially biodiversity and diversity of food crops. And one of the tragedies of our times is the monocropization, not just of our agricultural system, but I think of so many other aspects of modern life, kind of the monocropping of the mind in a sense, with the mass indoctrination of ways of thinking and ways of perceiving the world and how we should behave, and a school system that's designed kind of to turn out good factory workers more than free thinkers and creative visionaries for the future. And so when I look at our agricultural system, it is the same principle in sort of maximized and exaggerated, where we're taking extraordinarily biodiverse ecosystems and we're turning them into one crop, and we're killing the soil and we're killing the bugs, and then we're expecting that to create a culture for supporting life. And when you look at nutrition per acre, instead of just calories per acre, the spread towards more organic, local, regenerative kinds of systems becomes even greater, because we see that when people rotate crops, then the soil gets healthier, and they also are able to grow a lot more food, a lot more biodiverse food systems. And so with apples as an example, when you only have 10 varieties of apples in the world, then you're not set up for droughts and floods and different kinds of ecosystems. There are so many different microclimates in the world, so many different types of, some places it's drier in May and other places in June, and apples and all sorts of varieties have been cultivated that have worked with that particular ecosystem and that particular type of soil over the course of generation after generation. And to think that we have all that figured out and we can just stick one thing everywhere is such a loss. And what it does is it does create a level of vulnerability. I mean, if you were a cabbage moth and you see this massive bunch of cabbage, where are you going to want to go, right? But if it's all mixed up with a lot of different things, you might be a little more confused, So I think that we are actually creating magnets for certain kinds of pests and diseases to spread when we create these massive fields of one thing, which makes it very, very difficult to really grow food healthfully. So we need that diversity, we need the soil to get diverse, and then that's part of what creates a healthy ecosystem. And also the other reason I want 10,000 varieties of apples, I want to taste all of them.
We are talking a lot about chemicals in the food system. Stacy, you wrote a book about chemicals in the cosmetic industry. Do you want to comment on that, on how it relates to this?
So I'll just say, well, that's how I got started, was looking at chemicals in cosmetics and trying to educate women about the products that we're putting on our face and our hair, and the bathtubs with our kids. Also contain toxic chemicals, and many of the same chemicals used in lots of products. And people think of the beauty industry as innovative, but it's actually remarkably not. They've been using the same formulations in all the products for decades, and that's from the most expensive to the least. Where they have been innovative is in packaging and then marketing and finding new ways to convince us that we need, our hair should be straighter, our hair should be lighter, our skin should be lighter, our skin should be darker with spray-on tans, our lips should be plump. bumper. We aren't good enough the way we are. So we all have to go out and buy a bunch of toxic chemicals to make ourselves feel beautiful and whole. I loved what you said, Ocean, about the monocropping of the mind and the colonization of the mind. I think that's the biggest thing that we're having to fight against. And also the grief of it and the overwhelm. And having worked against beauty companies for years and then switched to food and pesticides, it's so much harder. It's so much harder because the resistance is so much greater. The propaganda campaigns are so much more sophisticated, aggressive, and desperate. Because as we've said, and all of us have said, our food system can't continue as it is, and it actually it requires these massive propaganda campaigns to sustain it. So I hope that I hope that's crumbling. I feel that it is, and that people are seeing through to the truth, and that you can't stop the rise in consciousness that's happening around these issues. And that all of us talking to each other and talking to our communities and being a leader in your community to be that person who's the pesty one, the relative that everybody rolls their eyes at. Some of you are probably that. I've definitely been that. But then they start to listen, and they start to see and experience in their own health that you might be onto something there. And I think that's how people are finding each other, is through searching for answers that they're not getting from doctors, and they're not getting from mainstream medicine, they're not getting in the schools. But they're seeing someone over there who dealt with this, or finding someone online, finding communities of help, people who've experienced it. So connecting in these times of such disconnection is super important. I hope we get to solutions. I think holding the grief is really important, not to say we can fix this easily. We can't. And I think even for those of us who've done this for 20 years myself, I have, but really the grief of it is just hitting me now from a combination of factors of really seeing like this is beyond. This can't be denied or ignored if you're really looking. Once you see, you can't unsee. So that's a problem everyone here will have if you don't have it already. You've taken the red pill or the blue, whichever. You really can't unsee once you see. So what do we do with that? We do have to hold it, and then we need to share it. And even if it's hard, and find ways to talk to each other, because the other thing I could say is we agree on so much more than we disagree about. Absolutely. The people across this country in both political parties and every party, people who don't vote, they are really pissed off about what's happening with the food. We raised millions of dollars online from small donors in the GMO labeling campaigns. Bernie Sanders' campaign has raised nothing ever like it has been organized in political history, because people are looking for some way to have hope and to give. So I think these are incredibly positive signs, and I think the connection is there. And whatever we can do in our own worlds from our own vantage point, it doesn't matter what you do actually in the world, whether you're in a corporation, work for a pesticide company, start your own small company, or just a parent, or just anything that you're doing in the world, is a place that needs change and healing and love and connection. So that's something we can stand more for every day and help each other.
Let me ask you a couple of just general questions, and again, answer any of them. Number one, what are GMO fish? What is wrong with them, and where do we stand with this subject? Number two, why did the new Impossible Burger that's well publicized decide to use a GMO ingredient in it? The Beyond Meat burgers didn't, so why did Impossible feel like there was a need to put a GMO ingredient? Third, a question I have asked in the past, but still curious. Bill Gates is one of the richest men in the world. He doesn't need money. Why has he been pro-GMO and unable to be convinced with all the evidence that you're providing? Four, are they spraying antibiotics on my food? I read that the grapefruits or something in Florida, the citrus, that they're allowed to put antibiotics. I thought that was concerning. And finally, I don't know if we've talked too much about soil, but there are a bunch of people that are very, very concerned that you can't get food unless you have soil. So any of these things that anyone would like to comment on?
All right, I'll bite on the burger, but not on the Impossible Burger. Steve and I are very, very aware of a friend of ours, Bill Christ, who spent years investigating an epidemic that was a tragedy. A company named Showa in Japan genetically engineered bacteria as a little microfactory to create the food supplement L-tryptophan. And we're selling the L-tryptophan into the United States in the 1980s, 84, 85, 86, etc. And the process of genetic engineering creates unpredicted side effects and was almost certainly the reason why there were 5 or 6 contaminants in this L-tryptophan that ended up killing about 100 Americans and causing 5,000 to 10,000 to fall sick. Because the process creates unpredicted side effects. That same type of microfactory is being employed by the Impossible Burger, not with bacteria, but with yeast. They take genes from soybean roots, put it in a yeast, and create leg hemoglobin, which looks like blood. They first gave it to the FDA and said, can you call this generally recognized as safe? The FDA said, no. It's never been in the human food supply. And by the way, you have 26 other proteins that this yeast fermentation vat is producing. They've never been characterized for safety either. And they constitute 20 to 30% of the stuff you're putting in, along with this leg hemoglobin. On top of that, they add genetically engineered soy sprayed with Roundup. There's so many things that could be wrong about this. It's ridiculous. There's a great organization, GMO Free America, that's pulling together reports from hundreds of people who report getting sick after eating the Impossible Burger. Please don't let your friends eat the Impossible Burger. You know, there's that friends don't let friends drive drunk. Friends don't let friends eat the Impossible Burger. You see, there's a myth that GMOs are safe, that have been around for so long, and we've heard this already. This was predicted by Louis Pribble, a microbiologist at the FDA, who said people are just going to assume it's safe because it's been around for so long. He was angry that the policy that the FDA was adopting was being written by Michael Taylor, Monsanto's former attorney, who eliminated all the scientific concerns in the policy. Louis Pribble's memo was made public because of the lawsuit pioneered by Stephen Druker. And Stephen and I have followed. Bill Christ passed away after his investigation and passed on his notes and a lot of his information for us, and we've been bringing it out. But I have to say, it is a terrible, terrible thing if the Impossible Burger is not brought down soon. Because everyone else is looking at this. Can we successfully genetically engineer yeast or bacteria or algae to produce something and have it accepted by the American population as a healthy alternative? Stacy just told me about Cargill's factory in Lincoln, Nebraska, $50 million factory, to use those same synthetic biology programs to produce genetically engineered stevia. There's already vanilla. They're planning to do all that. They're trying to do the essence of Ayurvedic herbs through the synbio.
They're also doing marijuana now.
Marijuana.
Monsanto has the patent on that.
So we have to stop this because it is picked up by Burger King and all these upscale restaurants. It's already being sold in stores. If we don't stop it, then the food industry will say, oh, well, it worked with the Impossible Burger, now we can do it. and then we get flooded with synthetic biology, and the only reason they found that the L-tryptophan killed people was because the disease was rare, acute, and came on quickly. If not all three of those had been together, it would still be on the market causing disease. And even though the disease was rare, acute, and came on quickly, it was almost missed. So we could be poisoning the food supply for decades and not knowing it. And the Impossible Burger is the poster child where we need to focus on. So please be active and tell your friends not to eat the Impossible Burger.
Can I, Stephen, I just want to add to the whole thing about GMO vat-grown products, because this is what Silicon Valley now is just pushing as the future of our food supply and the future of everything. One of the first GMO vat-produced medications was human insulin. Before that, people had insulin that was usually extracted from pigs. A few companies went and modified E. coli bacteria to produce, well, they said it was human insulin, actually. 2 weeks ago, a investigative journalist put out an excellent article on the research on this, showing that actually all they did was modify the pig insulin gene and called it human insulin. But basically the FDA gave them the go-ahead, and they started putting out this insulin. And what it's looking like now is, whereas with pig insulin, if people with diabetics, what happens is they can have illnesses either way. They can go into various comas depending if they've got too much or too little, but usually it takes time to come on. What was happening right from the beginning with this new GM insulin is that these effects in some people would happen instantly, and a lot of people were dying and are still dying from it. And yet this is all being covered up by the industry. Not only that, because they could produce this new insulin cheaper than the old systems, it ended up 3 companies in the world made these vats, make all the world's insulin, and all the other companies that made insulin are out of business. This is what they're doing with vanilla, with recombinant vanilla. They'll put all the world's vanilla farmers out because they will not be able to compete. They'll put the world's stevia farmers out. And, I think what I want to say here is they like to say that these are the same products, but what we're finding, as Jeffrey has said time and time again, unexpected results, and many of these results are fatal. And the Shoadenko, L-tryptophan, killed hundreds of people. I think if there's more investigation looking at the human insulin, this is the actual amount of people who have died will be in thousands. So that's the reality, and we've heard time and time again how these, and I'll use the word poison cartels, corrupt science. Stephen's book is one where, honestly, read this if you want to see the history of how science gets corrupted. And at times I had to stop reading it. I got so angry, and so distressed. But this is the truth about this, and people are dying as a result. And I think we'll find that the Impossible Burger is one of these. It will kill people, and many people, before it's taken off the market, if it ever is.
I would like to answer the question regarding Bill Gates, who clearly is a very intelligent man. And he and his wife Melinda, through their foundation, have been pushing genetically engineered foods very ardently because I think they believe they're doing good. And why do they believe the GMOs are good and are the answer, one of the big answers to the issue of growing better food and feeding people in the third world. Two basic reasons. First, he's been misled about the biological science by many of the scientists whom he's surrounded himself with, many of whom work for Monsanto or are pushing GMOs in other ways. So he thinks these foods have been well tested and are safe. And because, as we know, he believes in high technology, he thinks this is one of the gifts of high technology, and it's going to work for the betterment of humanity. So he's been misled about the biological science and somewhat ignorant about it because he's been listening to the wrong people. But unfortunately and quite ironically, he has ignored quite a bit of computer science, which, as I say, is very ironic given the fact that the money he's spending was earned through computer programming and getting a monopoly on one of the popular systems early on and then keeping that monopoly for a long time. Now, in computer science and software engineering, there are two basic categories of software. There's basically life-critical software and everything else. Life-critical is not what Microsoft was doing. Life-critical software is software that if it malfunctions, human life is probably going to be lost. Although Microsoft probably killed a lot of people out of frustration when earlier versions of Windows crashed, but still, let's not look at those heart attacks. But life-critical software is the software that governs pacemakers or X-ray therapy machines, or in the case of aviation, serve as airplane guidance systems. Those packages, when even the most minuscule revision is made by the very people who wrote the program to improve system performance and safety, regulators presume, they can't argue substantial equivalence, they presume that some perturbation to the system occurred which could cause malfunctions in unexpected ways, and the developers have to put that system through all sorts of tests all over again and demonstrate to reasonable certainty that there won't be harm in the system. And they wrote the system. Now, you turn around, because it's well known in any software system now that when it reaches a certain level of size and complexity, there's no way to do a precise surgical change that will not entail risks of unintended consequences. Even the people that wrote the systems reach a certain level of size and complexity, they become nonlinear and unpredictably nonlinear. So software engineers have learned the hard way that they have to test. Even the non-life critical gets tested. But the life critical, it's required that it gets tested. Now, the FDA's Division of Medical Devices, if the developers of a pacemaker software want to make a precise change to improve it, as I said, you can't argue substantial equivalence. You prove that nothing got messed up, and extensive regression testing, very rigorous and very expensive. You go down to another building in the FDA, to the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, Monsanto or DuPont comes in, they've just made a radical revision to the world's biggest, most complicated, and least understood information systems. And the FDA says, we assume nothing bad happened. You don't even have to test it. That's the way it is in the US. The FDA says you don't have to test. We presume it's all safe. Is that schizophrenia within one agency, let alone within society? So if Bill Gates dropped out of college early, he was so brilliant, he could make a fortune without understanding probably a lot of the theory of software engineering. I have a feeling he doesn't understand, this is just my feeling, that he doesn't understand life-critical software and the need for that kind of testing. I really believe that if you read Chapter 11 of my book, which is Overlooked Lessons from Computer Science, the inescapable risks of altering complex information systems, he would do a turnaround. And I'm hoping somebody he knows who's read my book will give it to him and say, read this, and I think we'll see a dramatic change, not only in their foundation, but then through a ripple effect, big one, through the world.
I think they call it the 737 MAX.
I wanted to go harder on Bill Gates, but that was good. And what he's doing is absolutely unacceptable. He's speaking in ignorance from a place of great power. He spent and I've heard him say just straight up, it's not that he doesn't have access to the information. It's that he does not want to hear or see the information that you're giving. He has in charge of his agricultural development team a former Monsanto guy, Rob Horsch, who spent 30 years trying to sell that technology within his own company as a pro-poor technology, which it absolutely was not and never that. And then he moved that philosophy over to the Gates Foundation, where they're selling GMOs as a pro-poor technology, where they spent $3 billion in the last 10 years to feed the poor in Africa, but most of that money has been spent on scientists and groups in northern rich countries to help poor Africans feed themselves. It's an incredibly colonial mindset, and what it's really all about is, and what they're doing, and he's funding a $12 million propaganda campaign at Cornell. He's normalizing all this, is why I find it upsetting. It's not just Bayer that's paying for universities to be propaganda outfits. It's the Gates Foundation. $12 million, Cornell Alliance for Science. I've written a lot about it. It's incredibly disingenuous. They put their spokespeople out to Africa to try to convince African governments to open up African markets to industrialized food systems, and they've been very resistant to these food systems in Africa, resistant to GMOs, fertilizers, pesticide, the whole scheme, which goes together. So that needs to be challenged, and so does the idea that billionaires get to control our world and do whatever they want to do, and so is the idea that it's okay to be a billionaire. I don't think it is, and there's a good, I don't think it is, and I think they spend an incredible amount of time convincing each other it's okay, and it's cool if you hook everyone on opioids as long as you donate to a museum. We're not going to mention that unmentionable stuff. There's a great book about this I'll just end with that I really encourage everyone to read about how incredibly impactful this whole thinking has been on our culture. It's called Winner Take All by Anand Giradis, who is a former New York Times reporter. And I can't believe we're down to 2 minutes. It's really true.
Actually, I'm going to ask you each to make a 2-minute closing statement.
Okay.
But before you do, I just want to say one thing. If you listen to this lecture tonight, you have 3 choices. 1, you could say, I don't think the information was good or accurate. I don't believe it. I don't care. I'm going to ignore it. And that's fine. If that's the conclusion you came to, that everything that you heard was meaningless, that's fine. If you were interested in quitting your job and going out and researching GMOs, chemicals, the food system, writing books, lecturing, and making this your life's work, that would be fantastic. If, however, you're saying you don't want to make any changes in your life, but you do think this is important stuff, there is a third fantastic, deeply impactful thing you could do, which would be to financially support the people that are on the front lines. So as far as Jeffrey Smith's organization, Institute for Responsible Technology, they have a shoestring budget, and they're doing fantastic things, and they need your support. And if you're thinking someone else has got this handled and someone else is going to donate, and there's lots of Jeffrey Smiths out there and lots of Institute for Responsible Technology that are going to do this, I don't know if that's the case. So if you feel like your money situation isn't ideal, give $1. If you feel like you could give 100, that's fantastic. You can give 1,000. In other words, this is, is as important as anything for all the reasons you're hearing. And if we don't support this, they might not be here one day, and then there's no one fighting for you and no one doing research. So I really hope everyone would support that organization. I'd like for each of you just to take 30 seconds and tell us, how can we support you? What is your organization? How do we find out more? And how could we support you if we wanted to try to continue to have you do the work you're doing? You want to, each of you, answer that?
Sure. I coordinate a group called No Spray Coalition, which is against toxic pesticides. And so you could go to www.nospray.org, and you could find out more there. And also you could please write, and we could add what you write to the website or to our listservs, and that would be fantastic because it's not just coming out of our heads, it's coming out of all of us and all of our experiences. And I thank you very much to the people in the audience for being here and for participating. So thank you.
You can go to foodrevolution.org. That's foodrevolution.org to check out our website. There are over 1,000 articles on there. We have 20,000 visitors a day learning about healthy, sustainable, ethical food. You can sign up for our email list. You can join in right there. There's a link to a master class with my dad, John Robbins, and I, which is all about helping you apply this in your life. Because at the end of the day, it doesn't just matter what you know, it's what you do. It's how you live. So join us, and also grab a copy of 31 Day Food Revolution. I'd love to sign copies for folks tomorrow if you want to get a copy. My grandpa invented Baskin-Robbins. We're saying we got to be better at marketing healthy food than he was at marketing ice cream.
I was a vegetarian for 7 years because of your dad and his wonderful book. I work for a group called US Right to Know, usrtk.org. We research the pesticide and food industry. We put documents online. We dig up documents they don't want you to see. So you can find all that on our website. We post the Monsanto papers. We're reporting on the Monsanto Roundup trials. And we have a list you can sign up for to get a weekly newsletter with food news for your health, usrtk.org. And thank you to Steve for this entire event. It's an incredible opportunity to really have long conversations with people. That's rare. And thank you to all of you for sticking with us for these hours. That's really impressive.
So let me just repeat that. That was USRTK, usrtk.org.
And thank you, Steve, for your encouragement for donations. If you'd like to make a donation to the Institute for Responsible Technology, you can go to responsibletechnology.org. We also have a newsletter, and we also have other programs available at livehealthybewell.com. I have a podcast. My last podcast, the one that expires tomorrow, is with Stephen Druker on the first chapter of his amazing book. And I'd love to talk to everyone on this panel for the podcast because you guys are amazing. I want to thank you, Stephen, and I want to thank the members of this panel. I turned to Stacy a little while ago and said, this panel's amazing. Isn't this panel amazing?
So just one more time, that's responsible, RESPONSIBLE, technology, TECHNOLOGY.org, responsibletechnology.org, and please really consider it. I really wouldn't want this organization to not exist. We need people fighting for us, and we're getting trampled if we don't have people, and we need this, so please consider this.
Oh yeah, livehealthybewell.com, livehealthybewell.com, and there's plenty of things there too.
When Stephen was talking, I had an image about really of the 737 MAX, and it says everything about our regulatory systems. In this case, they were relying on software that failed dreadfully, and you could see the collusion between the regulator and industry because they let industry self-regulate. And what happens? The plane crashes. And that's really a beautiful analogy for what is happening now. And, well, very much I'd love my organisation to be formed. I like the fact that there's a lot of us out here working together. I think this is really important. And the thing is, actually, we're friends. We aren't competing because we're on the same side and the right side of history. In the case of our organisation, Regeneration International, what we're about is regenerating agriculture, regenerating soils, but also regenerating communities, democracy, regenerating the health of people. and looking at ways we can turn around climate change, because all of these are existential threats. Please go to our website, which is www.regenerationinternational.org, and have a look. But Steve, I want to say thanks, because I really want to encourage you, whether you donate to our organisation, it's not that important to me. The fact is that you're supporting any of us, because we're all working towards stopping the 737 MAX that we're in crashing.
So the organization that I founded and I direct is the Alliance for Biointegrity, and the website is www.biointegrity.org. That's biointegrity, biointegrity.org. And we also operate on a shoestring budget. I'm sure that characterizes pretty much every organization up here. And help would be very much appreciated. And of course, buying a book helps a lot too, and I think it'd be well worth your while. But I want to, so anyway, thank you very much. And again, I want to express my appreciation to Stephen and his colleagues. They've done a great job, and it's been a pleasure and an honor to speak here. Thank you.
Can you spell that with biointegrity.org? Spell biointegrity? BioIntegrity.org.
On that website, among some of the information you can get on that website is you can see photocopies of 24 of the key documents that were pried out of the FDA files through the lawsuit. You can see in the FDA scientists' own words their warnings, and you can also see some interesting documents from officials where you can see the games that they were playing. So that's on the website too.
Well, when I shed my rubber suit and respirator for the last time in Italy after spraying pesticides there for several years, I decided to run to the light. And for me, the run to the light was to come back to the States and start working on organic agriculture with a group of young people. And so, when we feel this weight, the heaviness that we have here, I have to say that in some ways I haven't felt that for the last couple of decades, perhaps in quite the same way, because I'm working with the hope of tomorrow. And so I'm now at Sterling College in Vermont, and heading up the School of the New American Farmstead, which basically is just an incredible experience to be able to work with, again, not just young people, but people who are stepping into farming, people who are stepping into artisan foods and trying to find the way forward as I have in the past. So, just feel incredibly privileged. And for me, that kind of work every day with these kinds of people, really helps. But at the same time, there's a fight to be fought. It's a little bit kind of in the darkness sometimes, and we have to do that work as well. So I encourage you to try to find that balance. And so we're at sterlingcollege.edu, and you can look and see the programs that we have there in continuing education, professional studies for folks who want to find their way forward in all of this. And that's just an incredibly rich experience, I think. But I also really appreciate the dialogue here, and thank you so much, Steve. This is one of the best organized conferences I've ever been to, so thanks for all the hard work.
Okay, if each of you would take 1 minute to make your final concluding statement, 1 minute each.
Back when I was a student at Stony Brook, there was a professor there named Brett Silverstein, and he wrote a book, the first book I ever read on similar topics, called Fed Up. And it was the first book I've read about food and anything like that back in the 80s, I guess it was. And in it, he tells a story, which I will keep very short, of the new tomato that was being developed out in, I guess, California, with a thicker skin back in that day. And the reason they were doing that was so that it could be picked by the machines that were just being developed rather than by the farm workers themselves, so that the machines could then pick it and withstand the grip of the metal on it. And they shipped it. And so somebody shipped this new tomato out to people in Detroit to just check it out. And they dropped it on the floor and they tested it from different heights. And they found out that the tomato was stronger than the minimum federal standard on automobile bumpers. So ever since then, I've been thinking, I don't trust anything without it being confirmed somewhere. And I don't know, I like to keep that as my motto and remind myself of it every once in a while. Thank you.
You know, there are so many problems that we face in the world today that can feel overwhelming and even unconfrontable. And one of the things that's most disempowering, I think, is when we see things out there to which we have an emotional response or an instinctive response of wanting to do something, but what we do doesn't really seem to affect it. Things we see on television, for example, or things that our political leadership might do, and we can feel so small. But I think that what's so empowering to me is that when it comes to our food choices, we have incredible ability to make an impact. We really can shift the course of our destiny. We really can vote for saving farm workers from toxic exposure. We really can vote for a healthier ecosystem. We really can vote for animals not being tortured in factory farms. We really can take the power and the money away from corporations that are polluting our biosphere, and we really can put it into the hands of farmers that are caring for the earth and regenerating soil. And we really can take responsibility for our own health and step out of the grips of big pharma and big medicine and bankruptcy to step into reclaiming our health in our lives. And so I think that food is this incredible opportunity we have to really take a stand with our lives and to bring them into integrity with our values. So I thank you so much for your curiosity and for your partnership in this revolution.
Laughing felt really good. Thank you for that. Thank you for that. And just whatever we can do to feel good is what I'm trying to remind myself, to do what brings us joy, and to really support our young kids. Some of the young girls that I've seen standing up to beauty companies. When I was writing my book, I got so depressed thinking, I just can't go on, I can't go on. And I had been invited to this thing in San Francisco to speak for like 30 seconds. I dragged myself there, like I don't want to go. When I got there, I saw 20 young girls dressed in prom dresses and combat boots, like yelling into the microphone saying, we are going to kick the ass of the $50 billion beauty industry. And I was like, yes, okay, I can keep doing this because these girls are out there saying that. I was clueless at that age. And look at what's happening with Greta Thunberg. I love this. There's nothing that freaks the power structure out more than a girl who's willing to say what's what. So let's support our girls.
How many people are feeling like they want to do something more for the betterment of the world? Please raise your hand. It feels like that's a very good epidemic that's going around. That's something that I think is happening, that's one of the really great results of this catastrophe, that of all these different strange ways that corporations have run things. That people are stepping up. And I believe in my experience that there's callings inside of us, missions that we've come in to perform. And we may be knocking against a little ceiling of fear. Can I do this? Am I big enough? Whatnot. But on the other side of that ceiling is the part of who we are that is fully immersed in our mission, that's fully immersed in expressing the superpowers that we came here to wield. And in that space, it is fearless. So I am suggesting that instead of incrementally chipping away at the roof of your fears, that you leap above them into the part of you that says yes to it all, that says yes to being that great person who's here to make a huge difference. And I'll tell you from an experience that I have and the experience of those that I know that are working for the betterment of the world, it is an advanced technique of unbelievable proportions. The grace that comes to us, working without fear for the betterment of the planet and the people, is pure grace. It is something so sweet. It is a delicious secret potion that should never be secret again. Please take it, use it, and change the world.
The fact is, this is a revolution, and it's a grassroots revolution. It's not being led by governments, and it will never be led by governments. Governments follow, they do not lead. And from my perspective, as someone who's been involved in this for nearly 50 years, things are changing. We are on the right side of history. In the regenerative agriculture movement now, we are seeing every day articles about it around the world. We are changing farming. Farming organisations, United Nations organisations, political organisations, environmental organisations are all talking about regenerative agriculture. We can regenerate our soils to reverse climate change, but we can also, when we talk about regenerative agriculture, that's about ending degenerative practices. It's about regenerating our communities, regenerating biodiversity. And for me, the beautiful thing about this is we're surrounded by bad news. For instance, we are losing millions of farmers every year. However, when it comes to our movement, we know that we are growing by over 200,000 new farmers a year. We know our market is the fastest growing multi-product market, food market on the planet. And that says to me that we have everything right for moving forward. And I just want to say that we are on the right side of history. And, okay, I suppose most of what we talked about is negative, but what I want to say is that when we look at what is happening on the ground, it is really positive. We are winning, and we are on the right side of history.
Mahatma Gandhi's, I think, favorite maxim that has become really the slogan, the saying of the country of India, was taken from the Vedas, a verse from the Vedas, Satyam eva jayate, which loosely translated means truth ultimately triumphs, or truth alone triumphs. And even though it can seem agonizingly slow for that triumph to take place, I firmly believe that truth will ultimately triumph, that ultimately there's only so long you can keep a lid on the truth. There's only so long that falsehood can prevail. It takes much more effort to keep the lies going. In fact, as Mark Twain once said, in what I think is a wonderful expression, always tell the truth. You'll have less to remember. So, in any event, we could say orderliness will ultimately prevail over the incoherence, and that's truth. Truth is orderliness. Truth is the evolutionary power of nature. Truth is the goodness and the inherence and the good feeling we all feel when we do something good, or the feeling that Jeffrey described. That's being in line with the truth. Increasingly, that's why I wrote the book, Alter Gene's Twisted Truth, to untwist the truth and get the facts out there. Increasingly, I am aiming not to preach to the choir, but to talk to people who need to understand, who've been hoodwinked themselves. And I've been speaking at many more universities and meeting with scientists. And one of the most fulfilling experiences I had in the last few years was when I was invited to speak at North Carolina State University, which is one of the nation's biggest agricultural and engineering technological schools. And I was invited by their prestigious Center for Genetic Engineering and Society. And I gave 2 lectures, one a public lecture and one a talk in their colloquium series. But at the first lecture, the co-director of the center, who's a distinguished professor there, a biochemist, held up my book when she was introducing me, and fortunately, she had read it, and she stated it contains a wealth of information about both science and policy. It's incredibly well referenced. She said that. And then she said a few other nice things, and then she said, so I highly recommend it. And that was very heartwarming, and I got a nice email from another member of the center afterwards thanking me for challenging them, because he said too many of our students, our faculty and our students have too readily accept the claims of the biotech proponents, and you dealt with this in a respectful scientific manner, based what you said on evidence, and you were open to counterclaims. And so again, these things are hopefully having an effect, and eventually, within the scientific and academic community, there will also be a tipping point and a sea change, and I think we need that to go along with the grassroots as well. So we're all working in our own ways, and it's a great privilege to be with all of you and with all of you. Thank you so much.
Well, for a long-winded academic, I think I'll keep it sort of short here, but I think we really need to reclaim the narrative and the wisdom of our agricultural inheritances, and we need to turn truth into story, not stories into truth. Thank you.